Order. Good afternoon and welcome to this afternoon session of the Women and Equalities Select Committee and some follow-up work on our inquiry into misogyny in music. Can I welcome our three witnesses this afternoon? We have Jen Smith, the Interim Chief Exec of CESA, Andrew Medlock, the Interim Chief Operating Officer of CESA, and David Smythe, Deputy Director of Enabling Regulation at the Office for Students. As is usual, committee members will ask you questions in turn, but if at any point any of you wish to come in on a question that hasn't specifically been directed to you, please do just indicate and I will bring you in. And I wanted to start off with some questions to you, Jen, about the development of CESA, where it is currently and how soon you expect it to go live.
If I may, Chair, I just have a few opening remarks which I think will address the questions that you've put to me. This is a timely appearance before you because whilst the Misogyny in Music inquiry has concluded, scrutiny into how the music industry and the wider creative industries conduct themselves has not, and bullying and harassment and discrimination remain alarmingly current. CESA is set to go live by the end of this year in December, which is contingent on our funding ask. We appreciate this opportunity to update the committee as we have developed significantly in the last 12 months since I last updated you. We now have a 2-year business plan, operational blueprint, corporate strategy in place, and we move imminently into our year 1 and year 2 funding ask of our key stakeholders, which we anticipate will be successful. We're recruiting to key roles within our governance structures and are appointing a head of standards to lead that aspect of our work. We're pleased to confirm that we have wide-scale support from leading organisations across the music sector and beyond the wider cultural sector, with 80 leading organisations listed as supporters on our website, from film, TV, music and theatre, with audio, fashion, advertising, games and publishing set to follow coming into CESA in 2025. Finally, I'm pleased to tell the committee that we conducted a SNAP survey. PA Consulting, our consultants, did the survey on our behalf. We got the results last week. 800 creative industry professionals responded, and 91% were in favour of CESA, with 84% of those respondents saying that they would use our services once we go live in December, yet again demonstrating that CESA remains urgent and essential.
Thank you. So people when questioned about CESA were broadly supportive, thought it was an important setup to happen. What's awareness like if people aren't directly involved in a survey being asked about CESA? What's the sort of penetration level in the creative sector? Do they know you exist?
Yes, I would say amongst the freelance community there is significant anticipation about CESA services going live. In terms of our wider engagement strategy and visibility, we are not yet open for business, and we would not like to create the perception that we would be able to receive people's cases. Therefore, we have limited visibility on social media, for example, at this stage. We've also focused our engagement strategy on conversations with key decision makers, but rest assured we'll be ramping up our communication strategy as we move into our year 1 and year 2 funding ask and as we go live later this year.
You're going to build up to the launch with significant engagement strategy. I was concerned last week to hear from a leading person in the sector. When I asked him about CESA, he looked at me blankly. When I told him what the acronym stood for, he then did know. Is that much of a problem, and should we be referring to it in full rather than as CESA?
We're happy to do that. We've found that CESA is generally well socialised. Certainly my colleagues tell me in the music sector when there are panel discussions around the Misogyny in Music inquiry, there have been occasions where CESA's name has been mentioned and there's been spontaneous applause from freelancers in the audience. So there is good recognition about us coming forward and knowing that CESA exists and that acronym being widely known. Key stakeholders that are helping with our engagement, specifically in the music sector, are the BPI. Each of the labels have committed to CESA now individually. The Musicians Union Help Musicians, the Music Managers Forum, Live Nation, PRS. I could go on, the Association of British Orchestras. So we are confident that we have sufficient stakeholder support in the music sector and beyond to bring CESA to reality at the end of this year.
Freelancers are applauding.
Yeah.
Are the labels applauding as well?
We've spoken to each of the labels individually. We continue our engagement with them. They have shown their support and commitment to us by endorsing CESA on our supporters page. We continue to work with them on shaping our services, and we believe we can count on their full support.
And we've brought David from the Office for Students here today for a very specific purpose. Can you just, both of you in turn, I'll stick with Jen, tell me how you see CESA collaborating and working with the Office for Students?
Well, CESA will be, by its nature, a collaborative organisation. You know, we do not seek to duplicate provision, but we seek to address gaps in provision. We've already met with colleagues from the OFS to consider how we will ensure there is adequate provision and safeguarding for students working in creative settings.
Thank you. David?
So completely endorse all of that. We have quite a lot of experience of working with kind of other organisations that have links to students, who've got abilities to help students that we don't, or have information about students, or in turn where we're able to assist. So we work quite closely with the Office of the Independent Adjudicator, for instance, and I think we can definitely build on that with CESA as well. I think there is sort of lots of room for information sharing, signposting, making sure that that students are being kind of supported from every different angle, because there is a lot of interface between the academic side and the professional side in practice in this area.
Thank you. Kate?
Thank you very much, Chair. Jen, if I can ask you my first question. Could you set out to us what legal barriers there might be to CESA's work? So, for example, around GDPR provisions, and what progress, if any, you've made with the government to minimise or remove those barriers?
Thank you. Yes, as you would anticipate, we've taken significant legal advice in relation to GDPR. Our handling of data remains a critical success factor for CESA. We're confident that the advice that we've had is robust. We've requested a meeting with government to discuss a challenge that we have identified and mitigation to that challenge. We've requested that meeting, it's been offered to us, and we'll update the committee once that meeting has taken place.
Okay, so would we be looking at legislative changes to enable this to happen, to be able to support the work that you're doing?
I'll allow my colleague Andrew to speak to GDPR in more detail.
So as part of our final design phase, we've been looking at what range of services we want to provide and mapping that against our legal requirements. When doing that, we've not come across anything that is going to preclude our work. We don't see any showstoppers with regards to that. So we're confident that we can deliver within all of the legislative requirements that we have. What we're talking about here is that we've identified a number of things that we'd like to speak to the government about with regards to making CESA's work more efficient. Because we know that whilst we can safely navigate the GDPR, for example, we can see that there are things that can be done in order to make sure that we are doing that in the most smoothest and efficient way for the people who use our service.
Okay, thank you. And I mean, this question's to Jen, but you know, if you're better placed to answer, Andrew, then please do. I want to ask around defamation law. And how that might impact your ability to highlight serious examples of unacceptable behaviour.
Well, again, we've taken significant advice on defamation from leading counsel. We're confident that that advice is robust. This relates to the most serious and high-profile investigations that CESA may take forward in the future, but we are confident that we've been advised very well by our counsel. My colleague Andrew may have more comments to add.
Yeah, exactly the same principle. We've looked at it, we've tested it. We can see that we feel confident in this space, and we've taken initial advice and we'll get more advice. Key elements here is that we will be a confidential service. There's no running commentary. The work will be done in private with the parties involved, but most importantly, CESA will be an evidence-based, objective, investigative process. So it will be looking at ensuring that it is verifying any allegations that is coming to it and making sure that it's tested and people have the opportunity, obviously all parties have the opportunity to submit evidence and refute evidence so that we can come to an evidence-based finding on balance of probabilities. We feel that that is comfortably within the defamation law parameters.
And can I just ask you, you mentioned interested parties. Well, parties of in another way, I suppose, is later in the year we may expect a change of government. Have you had any conversations with any of the opposition shadow ministers?
We've kept all sides of the House informed of our progress, and we will continue to do so.
Okay, thank you. You've set out that CIISA will undertake investigations into historical allegations. What's the most up-to-date information that you have on the likely scale of that work? I mean, what does that look like? Are there limitations to that work? Do you have the capacity for it?
We have thought very carefully about this. We have a 3-year window in terms of historical allegations coming forward that we've put in our current plans. In terms of modelling demand, we're working very carefully with our PA Consulting, who are underpinning high-level assurance for CESA. Demand modelling is part of our immediate planning going forward in our design phase. But benchmarking is quite difficult because we are a unique proposition. So it's difficult to look at peer standards authorities and regulators and anticipate what demand might be. But we are confident in our business plan that we are accommodating for potentially a rush of people wanting to use CESA services in the first instance, and modelling for that in terms of how we will take our services forward.
Just to elaborate on the historical cases front, CESA's objective and role is very firmly in tackling what is happening now and also for the future, to future-proof the creative industries, to the workplaces within that aspect, whilst also recognising and balancing that there are things that we can learn and potentially act on with regards to historical aspects. But our core focus is on future-proofing the workplace culture within the creative industries. So that's why we're saying there is a 3-year provision, but we may override that if we can see that there is justifiable and compelling reasons to do so. And in particular, that could be that we can see that there has been a historical aspect, but there is a real prospect or likelihood that any harm is continuing in the here and now as well. So we want to make sure that we're balancing those aspects out. But it's really important to note that even if CESA had 300 staff, conducting formal investigations is an incredibly resource-intensive endeavour. We're not going to be able to investigate every single case. We want to ensure that we're balancing that out by early dispute resolution, through mediation, support and advice, to ensure that we're adding value wherever we can, but we'll only be investigating the most serious and complex cases. So we will need to manage expectations in that regard.
And of course, I suppose the issue there is that sometimes until you start investigating, you don't know which ones are the serious cases. So I'm just wondering, how do you manage that?
We will have criteria that looks at what would fit under a kind of serious and complex case. That's where our core provision of allowing and enabling people to report to us about their concerns enables us to actually build a picture, patterns, themes, where we can see that we could actually take the most amount of intervention and impact in a particular area as well. So if we got reports in a particular area where we can see that it's justifying, through evidence-based inquiries, that there is a pattern of behaviour or theme, then we would want to take action. So it's about how we strategise and use our resources wisely to get at the most important and impactful issues.
Okay, thank you. And in February, your update said that freelancers will not be able to access CESA's in-house investigation service. So could you tell us a little bit more about that, why that's the case, or how or why that decision was made?
If I could just give some clarity to that.
Yeah.
I think what you saw was a grid as how users we anticipate will engage with CESA. Really what we are saying there is that investigations are not an on-demand service, that CESA will make the decisions when we investigate and when we don't. But obviously, if freelancers come to us with legitimate concerns and we see that it is right that we should investigate, we will obviously do so. But as my colleague has said, we will use our resources judiciously, and we just cannot promise every freelancer that we will investigate every issue which they may wish us to.
Just to clarify, that's not a blanket decision, that's on a case-to-case.
Case by case, yeah.
Okay, that's good to hear. Thanks very much, Chair.
How did you land on the 3-year time?
We gave it real deliberation. with our legal advisors and equally with other colleagues that are helping us shape CIISA, we felt that there was a desire from the engagement that we had with freelancers to have some historical window. Others had suggested 5 years, etc. We've landed on 3. We think that is proportionate to the resources that we will have. But obviously CIISA will be operating proactively as we demonstrate our value, as we effectively shift cultural norms in the creative industries, which we intend to do. We will see, whilst there will always be a provision to look at historical cases, we think our positive, proactive interventions will ensure that that will be the main value for money benefit of CIISA that the creative industries will see.
Will you have the capacity, if a current complaint comes forward, to look back? I'm thinking, look, I'll give you a real-life example of the Harvey Weinstein type figure, where many of the complaints were very historic, yet there was current ongoing concern. Will your investigations have the ability to look back further than the 3 years if necessary?
In fact, that's a very good question. What we would want to do is to plan any investigation and look at what the breadth is, and then think about what resources are aligned to that, so that we can think about how we can do that in the most effective way possible. So we are alive to those particular points, and it could be that we are, particularly if it's a historic investigation and we're being asked by other organisations, for example, to do that, how we can ensure that we are appropriately resourced to do that if it means that it goes beyond our existing staffing resource that we have. So it's all about the planning, and it's all about the breadth and scope. So we want to be very clear about not going into fishing expeditions, for example, making sure that we're very laser focused on what needs to be addressed, bearing in mind that an investigation is very resource intensive and can take years if you don't get it right.
Thank you. Caroline.
Thank you very much. Can I talk to you about sanctions? Because I know when we were originally doing our inquiry, one of the concerns was that CIISA may not have the necessary teeth to be able to make a difference. Jen, could you just update the committee on the range of sanctions that CIISA will be able to impose, please?
Yes. Of course, the way we're describing these are recommendations that CIISA will make, and the anchor for those recommendations will be CIISA's standards framework. Whether that standards framework has been breached and determining how serious that breach is, we're always interested in proportionate accountability, and we will be developing our recommendations further. That's now imminent in our final design phase. We accept that our recommendations will not be binding because we're not a statutory regulator, but in the case of many self-regulators or voluntary regulators, most elements of the industry do abide by them. A good example that's already socialised within the creative industries of voluntary regulation is the BBFC, that determines age classifications for films. In practice, where we feel our recommendations may go could be educational provisions, organisational or systemic changes that we recommend, restorative impact, warnings that we may issue to individuals or organisations, and for the most concerning behaviours that we may find, that we would publish, we would refer to legal avenues or publish non-compliance with recommendations should that occur.
So what about the whole concept of being able to name and shame an organisation or an individual? Is that still on the cards, and to what and at what point and what circumstances would that be brought into use?
That's probably looking at the very kind of sharp end of the stick as such with regards to very serious behaviour. So also a recommendation or sanction that could be included in there is referrals to legal avenues, to other statutory regulators, for example the EHRC, or even to the police. What we are looking at in terms of our final design is that if we see non-compliance within our work, if we make a recommendation and we can see that there is regular or routine non-compliance, or people are simply, or an individual or organisation simply not listening to us, then we will look at how we publish that and look at the public interest aspect with regards to that. Because that's the very sharp end where we are seeing that people may challenge our authority. And we are very clear, and certainly in the conversations that we've had, is that the industry are backing CIISA to do this job. They're backing us to set standards, and they're backing us to enforce those standards. And obviously that goes with ensuring that that we deal with non-compliance correctly. So we will look at how we can publicise any non-compliance where we see that we've done as much as we can. It's now over to the industry to decide what to do.
Okay, so non-compliance is sort of what happens when everything else you've tried goes wrong. That's, that would be then you take those steps. So how do you kind of encourage compliance before you get to that stage? I mean, what are the steps that you'll be able to take to encourage people in that sense of direction?
So encouragement can happen in many different forms. The first one is that by having CIISA doing this work, we expect the industry to accord with our authority to make those recommendations so that they are accepted and complied with, full stop. If we see that there are areas where, and of course as Jen was saying, that we don't have binding powers here, if we can see that we have made a recommendation but it's very clear that either after a number of engagements it's not going to be complied with, we would want to make sure that we're taking that to the next stage, if I can call it that, in the way that I just spell out, including the possibility of us using a legal avenue. So if we said, well, actually, here is a statutory regulator within this space that actually can take this forward, or if there are legal avenues that can take this forward, then we would take it in that way.
So with that in mind, obviously CIISA isn't a statutory body, and you'll be using the powers of potentially others that are statutory bodies. But do you think in the long term you will be content with that as an approach, or do you think there will come a time when CIISA will have to become a statutory body in and of itself?
Sorry.
At the moment, this is the route that the industry have chosen. This is what industry have asked us to do. This has been endorsed in the sector vision by government to take this approach as a voluntary regulator. That is where we currently are. We are, just going into our year 1 and year 2 funded ask. We anticipate that will be successful. We anticipate that the stakeholders that have engaged with the work so far to get to this place will be true to their word and fund us. Should that not be the case, we'd examine our options at that point. But we feel that this is the right route for the creative industries at this juncture.
Okay, very good. David, can I move to you, please?
Yeah.
I think we've focused on everybody else far too much now. Let's have a chat with you. When are we going to see the new condition of registration for higher education settings aimed at protecting students from harassment and sexual misconduct?
Well, thank you. So I want to thank you for inviting me. And thank everyone who's engaged in the lead up into our consultation and beforehand. So as you know, we published that consultation last year. We had 216 responses, including an unusually high number from students. We expect the final decisions on that to be published in the second half of May, of next month, alongside the outcomes of the pilot prevalence survey that we did with students about sexual misconduct and sexual harassment. We're publishing next month. The sort of final decisions on that are yet to be made, but what I expect is that there will be a recommendation to have a condition in essentially the form that we put forward in the consultation, obviously really carefully considered and refined through responses, but having that in place with a kind of clarity that provides for students and the clarity of expectations it provides on providers.
Okay, so I appreciate then the decision hasn't been fully made yet, and so it's difficult for you to comment on exactly how it might work. But theoretically, could you set out the factors that might, for example, trigger an organisation to be found in breach of those conditions? And like similar question to Jen and Andrew, what kind of sanctions could be imposed against people who are found to be in breach?
Of course. So the first thing to say is that the proposals of the condition, it's in the shape of requirements for providers to have certain policies on harassment and sexual misconduct. So some specific elements about having policies, so having sort of appropriate, fair and transparent investigation processes, proper support for students who need it, but also requiring providers to set out the steps that they're going to take in their particular context to deal with things. So there are kind of consistent elements that we think are important for everyone, but we also want people to consider their own circumstances. I mean, your own reporting to misogyny in music, there are different challenges faced by students there than there are in say, kind of other large campus universities. So the condition is in that form. You have to have policies and you have to sort of meet them in practice is the framing. In terms of evidence, so we're not looking at sort of individual sort of complaint resolution per se. So we're not saying this person should have had a different outcome. We're not set up in that way, apart from it in the case of free speech, where we've been given complaint powers by Parliament. What we'd be looking at is the effectiveness of the policies. So if something, I think what's most likely to sort of trigger interest would be if something did go wrong in an individual case, or even more so in a series of cases, and we would say, well, why did that go wrong? Was it, an individual person who kind of outside of the wider control of the university or college sort of made a particular mistake, or does this expose that, this student said that they couldn't come forward, and when we look at it, actually we can see why they didn't feel they could come forward, because your policies weren't sufficiently clear, or because there's evidence that you didn't provide a sort of environment where they were confident to go forward. And so we'd be looking at the effectiveness of the policies and then whether they were delivered in practice. In terms of kind of what we do about it, a lot of our work with providers is just sort of based on engagement. So if we saw something come up, we would talk to them, we'd say, are there things you need to fix? We kind of want them to comply, we want them to sort things out. If we think that something's gone badly wrong, though, we can launch investigations into providers. We can impose specific conditions of registration, which basically says, in your case, sort of everyone has this general condition imposed, but for you have to particularly introduce this policy in this way to protect students. And then if they breach the condition, this condition or others, we've got really clear powers to impose monetary penalties on providers to fine them up to sort of £500,000 or 2% of qualifying income, which is essentially sort of student income. So that means that both kind of really big providers, 2% of qualifying income for them can be very big, but also for quite small providers, £500,000 is always going to be significant. We've also got, because you touched on this in questions to CIISA, about kind of identifying it to providers, and we've got really clear policies on publication that we would normally publish when we were investigating a provider. We would normally have published what the outcomes were, and in particular we would normally publish if we imposed a monetary penalty or a condition of registration, because we think that's where a lot of the value is in other providers being able to see what went wrong, to understand this is the sort of thing where if you do it, then you will be breaching the condition as well, and being able to make improvements.
So basically what you're saying is, in order to monitor compliance with the new condition, that would be triggered by something going wrong. I mean, you sort of don't keep a watching brief on whether the conditions being complied with as a matter of course.
So I think we have in general a kind of risk-based approach to regulation. So we've got 400 providers. We don't, for any condition of registration, kind of go to each provider and kind of check them systematically every single year. It's possible in the future that we might do some sort of spot checks in this or in other areas. But in general, we think it's the kind of most proportionate thing for providers and the best use of our kind of resource is to focus on cases where there's an indication something's wrong. I mentioned that might be high-profile individual cases. The other possibility is, as I said, we've piloted a prevalence survey approach, and so we might also see, if we did roll out a wider approach to understanding prevalence of sexual harassment and misconduct, we might see patterns in the data that didn't come up in any kind of high-profile way. So we might see that kind of in the data that indicates that we need to go and have a look and understand what's going on. And that again, mirrors how we deal with other conditions of registration. It can be reacting to kind of individual incidents that suggest there may be a problem, or it can be kind of flows of data that suggest there may be a problem.
So in some senses, a lack of data could be as worrying an issue as data which proves there to be an issue. I mean, yes. The reason I say that is, that multiple reports have said there are failings in the reporting structures in things like conservatoires or other settings that are dedicated to the creative industries.
Yes.
So that would trigger alarm bells if the reporting is showing, virtually no data, or data that is in some way cause for concern. Is that something that would be on your radar in terms of monitoring?
So we completely agree there are massive concerns with the reliability of reporting, and I think sometimes you see cases where I think sometimes providers do good things that actually increase reporting, and the risk to them is that is seen as being suddenly you've got lots of cases, and it's like, well, no, we don't have lots of more cases. We're just doing things that let our students come forward. But what I was talking about was prevalence. So what we've been piloting is an approach where we directly ask students, have you experienced this sort of behaviour? So it's not relying on reporting. It's not relying on people coming forward to their providers with problems. So if we did continue with that sort of approach, then we would be able to say to a provider, we see that you have an unusually high, or there's been an increase in prevalence. Have you had an increase in reporting? And if they sort of said, oh no, it all looks fine to us, then obviously that's not massively reassuring. It suggests that the problem is increasing, but the awareness isn't being raised to the university or college itself.
That makes sense. I mean, the thing is, if you look at things like gender pay gap reporting, there are some countries that have a very low gender pay gap, but they sometimes correspond with countries where very few women are employed.
Yes.
So, so I think sometimes you have to interrogate the data and say, well, actually, what's missing here, rather than what's cause for concern.
I completely agree, and what I'd probably add to that is in the way that we've asked the questions in our survey and polling, we've been quite kind of specific at times in a way which means sometimes the questions are quite kind of challenging to answer, but we're conscious that people we know that people respond differently to questions of have you faced sexual harassment, have you faced inappropriate behaviour from your academics in your organisation or whatever. People may have different understandings of what those things mean. People might answer those questions in different ways based on a kind of localised culture. So we think it's really important to try and get kind of as objective a sense of what's going on as possible.
And educate people as to what is and isn't acceptable behaviour, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so part of our proposals, as well as about I talked about investigation processes and support, but there's also proposals about training staff to be able to sort of deal with things appropriately, but also raising awareness amongst students of what both making sure that students understand what the policies are. So I know how I can complain, I know what my rights are, but also that students understand kind of what is unacceptable, that they kind of feel empowered to sort of challenge things, whether it's affecting them or whether they're seeing it affect other people.
Good, thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Can I just ask, David, you referred to, I think it was 216 responses and an unusually high level of response from students. Can you share with us what number of students did respond?
So it's about, I think it's 17% of the response are either from students or student representatives. So it's by no means a majority, but it's a lot more than we've had on lots of other conditions. Obviously, lots and lots of providers always want to respond because they have to kind of deal with compliance. But there's an unusual level of engagement in the formal responses. We also held student roundtables and sort of webinars to bring in student voices as well.
Is there a gender split?
In the individual people who responded, I don't actually know, so I'll check that. We can write to you on that. I don't know if it would always become clear because sometimes the responses are
anonymous,
corporate, so we will get a response from the student union for X. There were individual students, but most of the responses, I think, were representative groups. So the person holding the pen...
that's an irrelevance,
yeah.
Thank you. Kirsten.
Thank you. So maybe if I can stick with you, David, and look a little bit further at the excuse me, the pilot prevalence survey from last year. And I wonder if there's more that you can tell us about the findings, but also the next steps. What do you see as the priorities from here on in?
Sure. So I don't want to say too much about the findings just because it's kind of sort of official data, and also it's data that we need to engage with the providers who participated, who agreed to be in the pilot prevalence survey. So I don't want to give lots of statistics. In broad terms, though, definitely I would say that the prevalence survey I think tends to support the sorts of concerns that we thought we might see going into it, but it does definitely indicate problems in this area. It's quite helpful because it goes into a reasonable degree of detail, so it gives us a bit more nuanced information about the sorts of issues that students face, the sorts of environments they face them in. So we see quite significant amounts of sexual misconduct, sexual harassment occurring within a higher education setting, but also outside of it. And so kind of understanding the different sorts of things that people face and the different forms that takes. In terms of next steps, I expect that we will give a kind of indication of that, probably not a kind of a fixed policy position because we'll want to consult more widely on it, but I think we'll give an indication of that when we publish the outcomes of the pilot. I do think that, as I was saying to your colleague, I do think it's really important. I think prevalence data is very valuable, though. I think that, as we said, it can't be substituted for by reporting data, and so I think we are really interested in finding a way to make that work. What we need to understand is what tools are most useful for the two slightly different purposes, which kind of both of which are met to an extent in the current system of getting kind of sort of detailed information about the sector in general and the sorts of patterns of things that affect students and how those might arise, that helps kind of raise awareness and educate and help people develop interventions, but also the sort of provider level information that would allow us to say, we can look at a group of whether it's a group of creative industry providers or a group of sort of campus universities, and say this one is a bit of an outlier. They seem to have more of these sorts of issues than others. And so we're looking at our kind of statistical tools and polling tools to see what's most likely to get us those things.
When do you think you will publish?
So we expect to publish all of this in sort of latter half of May, so in about a month's time from now.
Okay, thank you for that. If I can move on to Jen. Our report on the music industry received widespread coverage. As you know, many people in the music industry did come forward with their own stories of discrimination and harassment as a result of that. I wonder if you have seen an increase in people's interest in the role of CIISA over recent months, perhaps connected to that.
Undoubtedly so. I think the report was a landmark piece of work. It has been a lightning rod for action in the music industry. It has been an essential backdrop for the conversations that we are having with key leaders within the music sector, and we're very grateful for the endorsement that this committee gave to CESA in that report. Indeed, we have taken action already on the recommendations with which you cited CESA to take action immediately. They are already in train, but it has really been a pivotal moment for the music industry to focus their energy in dealing with this issue, and CESA and supporting CESA as part of that.
And you recently did your own survey of the music industry. I wonder what information you were looking to gain from that survey and whether you're able to share any of your findings with us today.
We can share some of the headline data. Again, it is utterly compelling. 91% of the 800 respondents from film, TV, music and theatre were in favour of CESA. 84% saying that they would use our services once we are live. We were very happy with the response rate. It was a snap survey. Our colleagues and partners, Black Lives in Music, are currently doing a very deep dive, long survey into bullying, harassment and discrimination in the sector. We work closely and collegiately with them. We've linked to that. That data will also shape CESA's services. This is our SNAP surveys in tandem with more qualitative research that we will be taking forward, longer term testimony from individuals. My colleague Andy might speak a little further about that.
Yeah, one of the core premises of doing the survey is to begin that engagement with prospective users, and we really wanted to know more about, is there support for CESA? Is this something that people want to see? Would they use it? Obviously, we've had some very positive, but also be thinking about what do they want and expect to see from CESA as well, in more general terms. So what we were told is that the top 3 important features for CESA is that nobody is victimised by using CESA, and that CESA is a confidential service, and that CESA is independent. They were the top 3 things, and they correlate with a question that we asked about what are the top 3 barriers for you at the moment about reporting. And it comes as no surprise that the impact on their career, the negative impact on their career within the creative industries was top of that list, alongside the feeling that the problem won't be resolved, and that there is a feeling that there is a lack of confidentiality when reporting. You're reporting to the very organisation or the people that you may be raising concerns about. So it's really important data for us. It tells us that there is a real need for CIISA, there's a real support for CIISA, but we've got to get it right about establishing trust and making sure that people can report to us without that fear of victimisation, and that it is a confidential process, but most importantly that we protect that second eye within our acronym, that we're very independent and that we're able to speak truth unto power to those organisations through the reporting of those concerns from individuals.
Thanks for that. And so if you look at that, maybe taking it a step further, in terms of reports and investigations, are you confident that you will have the resources you need to cope with the potential workload? Maybe to Andrew and Jen.
We are confident with regards to that. CIISA is a unique service and a unique organisation, so we don't have anything to benchmark it to at this present moment in time. This is the first port of call for us to show that there is potentially quite a lot of demand for CIISA. So we will look at that. We will work on our demand modelling and capacity planning. And what we want to do is obviously focus on how we can be the most effective with the resources that we have. And there's a lot that we want to do in terms of early dispute resolution and mediation that avoids the formal, very resource-intensive investigation. But very importantly, and we're hearing this a lot as well from organisations and individuals, having that educational, that preventative aspect of CIISA is going to be really, really important as well, so that we start to talk about standards, we start to have a singular vision and consistency about what is and what isn't expected, and we start to educate and train and inform people and support people within those organisations as well, so that they are tackling these behaviours before they become issues. Because CIISA can't solve everything. I think the report very wisely said that CIISA can't be the panacea for the music industry and the creative industries. If there's going to be culture change, it needs to occur from within the industries itself, but we're there to support it. So utilising that resource and strategically, we feel that we can really make a difference.
Thank you. And Jen?
Yeah, I think what the survey has also highlighted to us is CIISA's unique point of difference. What is missing in the sector at the moment is that single point of accountability, that one place where behaviours of concern can be reported to, and the objectivity and trust that we will bring to people using CIISA, because we are an independent body. We're confident about our business plan. Nobody knows, the volumes of people coming to us. We know demand for us will be high, but we are modelling for that in terms of the resources that we're requesting from the industry to back CIISA so that we can be live by December.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Jen, this might be a wholly unfair question to ask you. So look, the report that we did on misogyny in music shone a light on some of the issues that there are. And I think you just referred to it as having been an incredibly useful piece of work for highlighting the problems, for encouraging people to come forward. I'm very aware that we don't want that work to wither and die. How can we best keep the pressure up on the industry, and how can we best make sure that CIISA is an effective body?
Your scrutiny and attention to these issues is essential. I think I can't emphasise that enough. The report was absolutely fundamental in shining a light on these issues, so we would like to continue to keep this committee updated with our progress in terms of stakeholder engagement, in terms of securing the funding, which we anticipate will be successful, but is imminent in terms of asking for our year 1 and year 2 funding. We'd also like to work with you on some of the recommendations that you put in the report in respect of perhaps having a further conversation with government. There are 3 areas where we would like to discuss them further with you. Further conversations regarding the prevention of misuse of non-disclosure agreements.
Don't worry, there's questions coming on that.
Okay, we'll go there. But, yes, we want to keep our engagement with you live. It is fundamental to keep laser-like focus on these issues for the music industry and the creative industries as a whole.
Thank you. Caroline?
Terrified me the way you just said die there. That was... sorry, Jen. When one of our recommendations was that you had a conversation with the Music Managers Forum on our recommendation to work together to develop and oversee some kind of mandatory accreditation programme. Can you update us as whether that's happened?
Yes, we speak very frequently with the Music Managers Forum. We have secured a date and convened representatives from film, TV, music, theatre and fashion actually to look at commonality of issues around accreditation for key roles in those respective parts of the creative industries. That discovery session is taking place in early May, so CIISA has already used its convening power to look at issues in the sector where we feel that we could make a difference. So yes, that action is already in train.
Really good news. So what kind of, I know I'm probably putting you on the spot here, but once that meeting happens and if you decide that such accreditation would be a good thing, what would be the timescales for being able to get something like that rolled out?
So I think that is a good question in terms of how we build that into our operating model, but one of the things that my colleague Andrew and I have discovered in our engagement with the sector is that there is a real appetite for training and accreditation for key roles in the sector, not just within music, but for example, intimacy coordinators, chaperones, fashion agents, modelling agents, etc. So there is a desire to do this. What we want to explore is how that would work in practice, what timescales might be appropriate to bring this in, other relevant sectors within the creative industries that might have similar roles, casting agents, for example, that want to look at something in this nature. But we've already started that conversation because we recognise there is a real desire to move forward with it, but we will update the committee in writing once we've held our discovery session.
Yeah, that would be really helpful if you could let us know how those conversations go. I think we'd like to keep an eye on that. The other thing we highlighted in our report was the issue of recording studios and live music venues being particularly problematic locations, as was reported to us during our inquiry. What do you think CIISA, having had a chance to sort of digest all that, what do you think CIISA can do through standards and training to improve safety in those sort of settings?
So what we are proposing is that we have a standards framework with associated codes of practice for specific nuanced environments. And with the Music Producers Guild tomorrow, we did a webinar with senior leaders from that organisation recently. There is an appetite to have a specific code of practice in regard of studio space that will be attached to CESA standards. So there will be teeth, if you like, for whether that is breached or not. So that's our way of moving forward in that regard. But we've had a meeting with senior leaders from the MPG and there is appetite to go forward in that way.
Mm-hmm. And in your response to our report, you also said that you thought CIISA had a role to play in increasing representation and diversity across the sector. Can you talk to us a little bit more? What role do you think CIISA can legitimately play in that?
I think intersectionality and representation is incredibly important to CIISA at all levels in terms of governance, in terms of our staff, that we represent the people that will come forward to us, that we understand that discriminatory behaviour, bullying and harassment go together, unfortunately, that we have a role in future-proofing the inclusivity of the talent pipeline. So it's absolutely essential for our relevance. We work very closely with Black Lives in Music, as you know, as our anti-racism partners, and they support our work and provide us with good critical friendship. But we also think this is something that we can embed within our standards framework so that we can help drive representation and inclusion through CIISA's work.
What would be, I mean, the collaboration really important, but I mean, what would be your sort of first step on, you know, in an ideal world? How would that look? You know, how would you meaningfully change the dial on this?
I think that's subject to further discussion with our key partners in terms of what does that look like in practice. But we're obviously going to be geared up to be receiving issues in relation to discriminatory behaviours, and we want people to know that they can come to CIISA, that we will take those complaints and issues incredibly seriously, and, you know, look at respective interventions that would be appropriate in that case.
Yeah, we've got an opportunity here to look closer about what the standards will encompass and what we expect, and we feel that we do have a role to play to have a conversation, convene a conversation, as Jen's mentioned, about what practical steps organisations and industries can take to improve representation. And we'd be more than happy to start that narrative and then think about what does that look like in the standards so that we can start monitoring progress with that as well. So we feel that we do have a bit of a potential hands-on role. There needs to be, as Jen was mentioning, more engagement about what that looks like, but we do feel that we could have a role to play within that regard.
Okay. You're not worried about sort of mission creep?
I'm worried about many things, and but that is an interesting point because the standards need to encompass so many different things. One of the core strategies that we've got is that we're not reinventing wheels here. There is so much really good work that's already undertaken, so we want to synergise that into one place. What we will then do, and this may also go to the question of kind of timeframes of what happens next, once we have the standards framework, we can then start looking at what does that look like in sector-specific terms, in terms of guidance. What do we think that, how would that particular piece of standard or standards be implemented or demonstrated in practice in the music industry, in the film industry, etc. and so forth. So we can then start looking at how that looks in practice and then start thinking about training and accreditation. Mm-hmm. So yes, there is mission creep potential, but because there's so much really good stuff out there, the real challenge is harnessing all that together in one set of standards.
I think we will always be true to CESA's purpose, which we've set out quite clearly, to prevent and tackle bullying and harassment of a discriminatory nature.
Yes. I mean, the two are very... there's so much overlap there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, interesting. Thank you very much. David, can I just quickly pop back to you? We have previously recommended that all first-year students undertake bystander training, and that you should be doing so a requirement of a condition of registration. Is that something that you're going to be implementing?
Sure. So the proposals that we set out last February talk about sort of training for students and awareness. We specifically we talk about bystander training. We specifically give bystander training as an example of the sort of training that could be done to meet this condition. So I don't think we've said. I don't know if we would say it must be in this precise form, but it is, I think, the only example that we give of the sort of thing that we mean by the kind of wider words that we use to describe the sort of training that we think students should have. So yeah, I think we very much think that bystander training is really helpful in this area and is something that we would support.
What kind of feedback are you having on that?
So I think broadly, a lot of the student responses are supportive to having that, and I don't think, I think a lot of providers are, that they wouldn't say, and that they wouldn't want me to represent them as saying that they sort of don't think that doing that sort of thing is important. The responses we tend to get from them tend to be in the form of quite a lot of them saying, we don't want you to regulate us, we want to be kind of allowed to sort of do it ourselves, or sort of stick to the self-regulatory space, and kind of practical concerns about how it will work in practice and what exactly does that mean, and when will it need to be done by. So we're thinking really carefully about implementation timelines so that people have time to deliver these things in practice. So I don't think providers are kind of think it's bad. There is a concern from providers about and students, actually, we've had from some of both, about the proposals in the consultation for it to be mandatory. So there are concerns that there might be individual students who feel who've experienced things in this area, and then there's a sort of training that everyone has to go to, and they feel sort of isolated and vulnerable going to that training, and they kind of find it traumatic. And we're thinking very carefully about that, because what we don't want to do is say just make it optional, because we think there's probably quite a lot of people who just wouldn't go if it was optional. And so we're thinking about whether it's more in the space of it's a thing which is sort of in principle mandatory, but individual students may have kind of exceptional circumstances like they do for other things. Although I think my view would be that if you were a provider and you were finding large proportions of your students said that they found it kind of too sort of traumatic or hostile or difficult to attend the training, if I wasn't a provider, I would want to be really examining why is that and how can we support them to participate, rather than say kind of, oh well, 30% of our students don't want to come to our training, it's their choice. So, I think it's something that they would want to reflect on.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, thank you, Chair.
And some of the most compelling evidence I think that we took during the inquiry was from Charisse Beaumont. And you touched earlier on some of the intersectional issues. I can remember very clearly saying that if we felt that women in music were discriminated against, then black women in music were severely discriminated against and over-sexualised and faced incredible pressures based on kind of sexualisation, appearance, etc. What specifically do you think you can do to help black women with those intersectional challenges, and how can they effectively be tackled?
As I've said, Black Lives in Music have been one of our key supporters. They've been with us from the start of this journey. We partner with them very effectively on CESA's ongoing work. Dr. Kienda Hoji, who is on the board of Black Lives in Music, is going to join our co-creation council imminently so that we can have a thorough work stream looking at CESA and anti-discrimination. So we anticipate that work coming forward shortly, but Dr. Charisse Beaumont, as you say, has given compelling evidence to this committee and continues to inform and shape how CESA will work moving forward. They are key strategic partners for us. It's something that we do want to address, but we are doing that work in our final design phase with that organisation and with Charisse.
Thank you. And David, back to you and providers and bystander training. Can I just dig down a bit into whether you're expecting much resistance from providers or perhaps with student unions who think that they're in a good place to regulate themselves because they've got a sort of massive tome of rules and regulations already and they don't want any more?
I think I don't think I'd say I would expect resistance. We've in the consultation we've had pretty solid support from students. We've had quite a lot of providers saying these are really important issues, but we want to kind of continue to do it ourselves and kind of not have it be a regulated requirement, and we think it's kind of or mission creep is saying to other witnesses, and indeed those views have been expressed in Parliament as well. It's something where there are people who think this is kind of not kind of our core business. I think if we introduce a condition in this area, I wouldn't expect the sector to respond by saying, well, we don't want to do it. I mean, I don't think that's what they do. I think they would seek to comply, and we would try and make sure that they were doing that effectively. And I certainly think student unions would want to engage with it. I think this is stuff which is kind of really beneficial to them. I think it's quite empowering for students and for student representatives to have really kind of clear standards set out that they know are kind of binding requirements on the universities and colleges that they exist within.
Thank you. Kirsten.
Thank you, Chair. If I can go back to you, Jen, and just touch on legislative changes, please. The government rejected all of our recommendations on changes to the Equality Act, to parental leave and limitation periods. If we were to call on the government to reconsider any of these recommendations, what would you see as the priority?
There are 3 recommendations that we'd like to further discuss with you should you go back to government in that regard. One is which is extending the time to make a claim around employment tribunals. The second is a further discussion on the prevention of misuse of non-disclosure agreements. And equally important is the extension of protections for freelancers under the Equality Act. It's those 3 recommendations that we would like to discuss with you further should you go back to government in that regard.
That's helpful, and as you know, we will come on to non-disclosure agreements. In terms of the employment tribunal issue, do you foresee the 3-month limitation period on bringing cases to employment tribunal as something that would put pressure on your work?
My colleague Andrew can answer that.
Yes, the recommendation to extend that to 6 months would certainly help with easing the pressure. We can see that providing people with a bit more time helps CESA to provide the right advice. So that's why we would strongly endorse that recommendation and also any return to government on it.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
And NDAs. So, look, the government rejected our proposal around NDAs. Is that an area that CESA can do some work on?
I've worked with Zelda Perkins, who I think is known to this committee for many years standing in the prevention of misuse of non-disclosure agreements. Some of the thematic analysis I think that CIISA will report on is the use of NDAs to cover up poor behaviours in the creative industries, as well as fear of victimisation. It is an area of significance in the creative industries that CIISA wishes to shine a light on, alongside the important work that Zelda Perkins has been doing for many years standing.
I feel very strongly, I'm sure other members of the committee do too, that NDAs have been used, exploited, misused to protect perpetrators and have seen perpetrators stay in very high profile roles. And I'm very conscious that it takes a Zelda Perkins, doesn't it? It takes somebody with courage and determination to speak out against their use. Do you think CIISA has a role there where individuals themselves don't necessarily have the grit of Zelda, but can CIISA have a role in exerting pressure on organisations to step away from using NDAs?
So one of the conversations that we will have with government is for CIISA to become a prescribed person in the relevant legislation, so that people who are subject to NDA can speak to CIISA with confidence. But as I say, we share your concerns about the prevalence of misuse of non-disclosure agreements in the creative industries, and that is an area of focus for CIISA.
Yeah, and it has two very specific issues for us. Obviously, the main issue is there should not be any misuse of NDAs for covering up sexual assault or any poor behaviour of any type. We're very strongly in agreement with the committee on that. The second aspect is that we know that NDAs, by their very nature, may cause people to fear coming to us. And it may cause, and it does cause the fear of speaking out full stop. So we would wholeheartedly agree with the recommendation about having a retrospective moratorium on NDAs in particular, but also, as Jen's quite rightly mentioned, the fact that NDAs or the misuse of NDAs may still exist means that people may be prevented from coming from CIISA. So we really are interested in having a conversation about how we overcome that through the route of prescribed persons.
Thank you. Now, David, we know that the government's legislated to act on the misuse of NDAs in higher education. That's coming into force later this year. What role does the Office for Students have in monitoring that?
Sure. So we will be consulting on a condition of registration which underpins the free speech duties. So the ban on NDAs is part of the free speech duties that sit on providers. We will have a condition that, in very crude terms, says comply with the free speech duty, although I'm sure it'll take more work and more guidance than that. And my colleague, Arif Ahmed, Director for Free Speech and Academic Freedom, will be leading on that. But we will have a condition that basically means that if you breach the condition, but more than that, I mentioned before that free speech was an outlier in that we have individual complaint powers too. So even before the condition of registration is in effect, from the 1st of August, when the legislative ban comes into place, individuals will be able to raise complaints directly with us, and we will consider every complaint under the free speech duty that comes to us. And so someone comes to us and says, I have had an NDA imposed upon me, and they're trying to sort of enforce this on me, or just they've imposed one on me, we will be able to look at that. We will be able to publish our findings and sort of set out what's happened in that case, make recommendations about what the provider then needs to do to fix it. So we'll have quite a kind of individual ability to intervene in those cases.
Thank you. I'm just going to check whether any other members of the committee had any additional questions they wanted to ask.
Can I just very quickly on the NDA thing, Jen, are you aware of, so in this committee and the Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee, we've met organisations that say they don't have NDAs, and then we met people who work for those organisations that say that they have signed something that seems very similar to an NDA. It might be a confidentiality agreement, it might be given a different name. Is that something that you've seen as well? Is this an experience that is quite common?
Yeah, I think, by not calling it an NDA, it has the same impact on that individual, and there is a prevalence of use of these agreements in the creative sector, which CIISA will shine a light on. We will report back to this committee and put in our aggregated data how prevalent the use of these agreements are, but it is something to turn the floodlights on. So yes, we share your concerns about them, and it's part of CIISA's remit to address it.
I think it's very striking, the number of people that have approached this committee confidentially, sometimes anonymously, highlighting their experience. And it may well be something that's referred to as a confidentiality clause, agreement. How do you expect to be able to collate those sorts of numbers?
Well, so first and foremost, we need to encourage people to come and report to us with regards to that. But we will be alive to the elements that surround what is happening here, be it called an NDA or a confidentiality agreement or something else. We'll want to explore whether people are being told you must sign this and you cannot speak about X, Y and Z going forward. And as Jen mentioned, we'd be able to then look into that and provide aggregated data. We're very clear as well, subject to the consultation that we want to have on the standards, that there will be something there that says this isn't acceptable. This isn't acceptable for anything, be it called an NDA or confidentiality clause, to be used to cover up poor behaviour within the workplace, so that we can then start benchmarking against that and, if needs be, taking action.
And I'm going to hit you with hypotheticals. Nobody likes a hypothetical question. But if you get a pattern and you find another organisation, business, individual who seems to have collected a bunch of NDAs against former, current employees, what will you do with that information? How will you take action against that body or whoever that has had a load of NDAs signed by their former employees? Get a name and
that's a really interesting scenario. So we're looking through case studies at the moment. Of course, it will be on a case-by-case basis. That would, I think, personally, would fall under that pattern of behaviour that is going against the standards. And that's why I think it's really important that the standards talks about it, so that there is an expectation. So in that hypothetical scenario, if we saw that there was a pattern of behaviour and it met our criteria, we'd want to investigate and explore that further, and then there will be a published report with regards to that. But of course, in between that, there could be various aspects that will come out that we will need to take into regard. But if we could see that there was a clear pattern of behaviour which was going against the industry-endorsed standards, we would want to call that out, and we would want to take action accordingly.
And I think, again, it speaks to that unique point of difference that is missing currently in the creative industries, that there is a single place of accountability where these patterns of behaviour or systemic failings can be identified and reported to in one place, so that we can take relevant action. At the moment, it's too easy to hide in the vagaries and the cul-de-sacs of the creative industries. CIISA will address that.
I'll ask one more question. Yeah, sorry, it just occurred to me. Are there any, I won't say organisations because I think that would be mean at this stage, but are there any sectors or subsectors that you would like to draw our attention to at the moment that have been less forthcoming engaging with CIISA's activities?
So we're really encouraged that we've had development monies and support from Amazon, but we would welcome further conversations with Netflix and Apple.
Well, good, she went
It's very specific.
Love that. Thank you.
If there aren't any additional questions, can I thank the witnesses for their evidence this afternoon? If anything occurs to you that you wish to share with us in writing after the session, please do. And I would expect an invitation back at some point, although I cannot guarantee it will be this Parliament now. Order, order.